Hey everyone, James here, bringing you another episode on Italian genre films, especially from the 70s and 80s. And this is a episode that I put off for a while. I did the other three Mount Rushmore directors of Gialli's, and I put off this guy partly because he is the most notable. He's probably also my personal favorite of those. And so this episode, if you haven't figured it out yet, I will be ranking Dario Argento's Gialli. So yeah, for me at least, the Mount Rushmore of Gialli directors, I think it's a pretty clear list here. You have Sergio Martino, you have Lucio Fulci, you have Mario Bava, and Dario Argento. And of those directors, Argento was easily the most prolific, maybe the only other director that's made a similar amount of Giallos in a very different time period is someone like Umberto Lenzi. I don't even think he got up to 14. He's probably more like 10 or 11 or so. And I think when you're looking at the Gialli genre in general, and you're looking at the things or you're trying to describe the appeal to it to someone that doesn't know that much about it, then you are kind of describing an Argento film. You're talking about the visuals, the set pieces, what's so striking about it, the crazy use of music in them, and I think a lot of those same things that you're talking about there apply to Argento. And then I think when you branch out to a couple of those different other masters, people like potentially, especially Fulci, to a lesser extent Martino, the strengths and the weaknesses could be a little bit different. And I think those directors in particular kind of stand out in the sense that they swerved a little bit from, especially Fulci, from kind of what Argento was doing. While Argento was in these kind of like very urban settings and stuff to kick off with the Animals trilogy, Fulci went into southern Italy and was doing like Don't Torture a Duckling and things like that. And so I do really think he probably defined the genre, probably most notably with Bird with the Crystal Plumage. And one thing also worth noting is he is a director that, while he did do kind of his series of Animal trilogy at the beginning of the 70s, he's someone that worked largely outside of that kind of golden age of Gialli. And he's someone that also worked with really great people to start with. We all don't have the privilege of working with a cinematographer as great as Vittorio Storaro on his first film when he's like about 29 or 30 years old, and scored by Ennio freaking Morricone, perhaps the greatest film composer to ever walk this earth. So while Argento obviously kind of came in with a lot of like power, I think largely due to his family, his father being like film producer, as the industry declined, he's someone that also continued to be able to make films. So he did 14 Giallis. Probably only that Animals trilogy is kind of in the golden age there. And a lot of these films he made after kind of the Italian genre industry really had fallen off a cliff. And that's not to say that he wasn't impacted by that. He could still make films, but I think in many ways kind of what he was making probably was a lot kind of relatively lower budget than what it could have been in like especially in the mid-70s, but also even like the early 80s, just as the Italian film industry fell off a cliff. In fact, one of the people that's written a book on Argento, Maitland McDonough, I've seen her theorize that kind of his fall off is mainly due to kind of not having the budget to realize kind of his visual goals and things like that. So that's interesting. I don't know if I necessarily have a great opinion on that, but or a different opinion or anything like that, but it is kind of worth noting. So again, I'm talking about the Gialli here, so we're going to be omitting his kind of more straight supernatural films like Suspiria and Inferno. For me, at least, those are absolutely in kind of like the top tier, probably the Mount Rushmore, the top four of Argento films too. Last thing I want to mention too before I kind of get too far into the list too is if you are interested in hearing me talk more about kind of Argento's films, please do check out the Film podcast, which I do with my good friend Iñaki. We've covered just about every Argento Gialli, and well, we did Suspiria and Inferno as well over the last few years, so definitely go check those out. It's quite fun to watch those films and watch them with someone else, kind of in spirit at least. So let's see. I think he is also a director that kind of does help to rewatch a lot of his films too. He's a director that does have very clear strengths and weaknesses once you kind of get into his filmography that become quite apparent. And I think those strengths and those weaknesses probably become even more obvious the later into the career you go. So there's films, so if you kind of know what to expect from an Argento film, I think, and you want to enjoy yourself, I think you're far more likely to be a little bit more forgiving knowing those characteristics too. So I've rewatched just most Argento films, not quite everything, but I think most things have held up really, really well on the rewatch, and there's a handful of them that have definitely risen up kind of in my own personal rankings as I have watched those. Yeah, so one of the fun things about doing this is, for me at least, I like to think about kind of canon things and things that will kind of go down as sort of like all-timers and stuff like that. In some ways, it's kind of silly. Obviously, it's still very subjective and subject to this. But for me, at least, I enjoy it. I like that list-making exercise and things like that. So for me, it's fun. Going through these lists and stuff, looking at what I would consider personally to be like film giallis that I'd put in kind of like the ultimate canon, things that you'd probably consider to be borderline top 10. I think Fulci has 3 films that I'd put there: Bava, 2, Bay of Blood, and Blood and Black Lace. Martino's probably the hardest to do, 3, and for Argento, I think it's probably 4 giallis. And if you want to toss in his other films as just kind of Italian genre films, probably 6, with Suspiria and Inferno joining them. And he's easily the most seen director on Letterboxd. I kind of went through and looked at kind of the most seen giallis of the other masters, and it's much, much less than Argento. Bava is probably the second most seen, and his films are still seen by a fraction of the number of movie lovers that Argentos have. Okay, so gonna kick this list off on the D tier, which thankfully only has 1 film. So these are films that I just considered to be totally not enjoyable, not worth recommending, not even for the right audience. For me, at least, Giallo from 2009 is easily my least favorite Argento gialli film. It just doesn't come together at all. It doesn't look good. It's almost like he's trying to keep up with trends, which I think is kind of a reoccurring theme throughout Argento's career, but it just doesn't work at all. He seems too influenced by something like Hostel. The music is bad. It just doesn't showcase any of Argento's strengths at all. And so for me, that film is definitely not a recommend at all. So not good. So let's move on to Stendhal Syndrome, which is in the C tier for me. So this one's probably a little bit of a controversial pick. A lot of people I know rate this as like his last great film or his last good film. I personally don't agree with that. For me, that's Sleepless as kind of his last good film, or maybe even Dark Glasses to some extent. But Stendhal Syndrome, for me at least, it just doesn't showcase what I like about Argento. I find the subject matter to be just fairly unpleasant. It's very much centered on rape, with this very, very bizarre syndrome called Stendhal Syndrome that you sort of get fixated on artwork. What I do find funny is that he goes from trauma, anorexia, to one of the most obscure syndromes that no one's ever heard of. So he's kind of talking about 2 different disorders, going from one that's super common and definitely talked about a lot if you lived through the 90s in trauma and anorexia, and then going to something just totally batshit in Stendhal Syndrome. Another thing I don't like about this film is I can be more forgiving for films I don't care for if there's something like 75, 80 minutes or 90 minutes long. This film is 120 minutes long. It's too long. I don't feel like Asia Argento, while I do think she is good in some movies, and I think she's finally good in one movie, in Dark Glasses, that her father has done. I think she's just a net negative easily on this film. I don't think she's a great actor at this point. So, and I don't think her father really knows how to use her that well too. So, definitely a thumbs down for me on Stendhal Syndrome. That being said, visually, there are some really nice moments and there are some places where you're like, okay, Argento still has some stuff going on here. So if you're a hardcore fan of Argento, I do think it's still pretty essential to watch this. My opinion, does differ from a lot of people's here. I do know a lot of people that do like this film considerably more than I do. So, it's not a total wash, but it's one that I rewatched it in the past year, hoping to like it more, and I ended up more or less kind of feeling the same as I did on the initial watch. So a pretty disappointing film for me. Okay, so also in C tier, I have The Card Player. I have less to say about this film. I find it to be watchable, but perhaps one of the most forgettable Dario Argento films. It's also kind of feels like a film where he's trying to keep up with the times, but doesn't totally know what to do here. The set pieces aren't his best. For some reason, it's centered around gambling and 5-card stud, which is just bizarre. So it's just hard to take it too seriously. I don't have that much to say other than you could watch it if you like, but it's not one that I would watch unless you are an Argento completist. And I think if we're talking about his post 2000s Gialli, then I like at least 2 of those films more. Okay, so B tier. So here's films that I like, but they're not quite on that A tier level of films that I really enjoy and would rewatch. So these films I don't mind seeing again, perhaps, but they certainly wouldn't be at the top of my list, especially given that Argento's list at the top is very, very loaded. So most recently, I have Dark Glasses, and I'm really pleased he made this film. His daughter is actually good in it. And what I thought was interesting about this film is it feels less like a greatest hits film. For me, that film is Sleepless. But it still does a lot of stuff practically. It's also oddly kind of emotional for an Argento film. Very few of his films kind of get me going on sort of like a more character level. This one, oddly enough, did. And I don't know if it's me just kind of feeling emotional about like the Italian master now in his 80s making potentially his last films. But yeah, I did quite enjoy this film. It doesn't quite have the crazy highs of his other films, but it's also quite short, and I think is a film that, I didn't have to look at my watch at all, and I thought it flowed pretty nicely. So it doesn't have kind of the unevenness that would often plague a lot of his films from the 80s and 90s and 2000s, or I should say mid to late 80s, rather. It looks very different from a lot of his other films. In many ways, I probably would not have pegged this as an Argento film, even though kind of some of those characteristics are there, of sort of like this woman that's been blinded, being stalked by a killer and things like that. That sounds very familiar, but it's done in a way that's quite different. So I think it's a solid film. It's definitely not a film I would recommend to anyone that's just getting started with Argento. You should definitely start in his much earlier films, but it's a film that, for people that are fans of his, I think you will probably enjoy it. Okay, so next up, so this is probably another one that's controversial, but I think we're starting to get into that zone where there are films that certain groups of fans will rate higher than others, and there are certain films that work just a little bit better for me than this one, and this film is Four Flies on Grey Velvet, the last film in the Animal trilogy. Visually, I think this film is really starting to come together. I think it looks better than Cat and Nine Tails, but I don't like it as much as that. And I think part of that comes down to just, it's hard for me to place on this. It's a film I did rewatch. I think part of it does come down to the lead, who I find to be just not particularly compelling. His other 2 Animal trilogy films have Tony Musante and Carl Malden, who I think hold the screen a lot more than Michael Brandon in this film. One interesting thought I had, and this almost might sound a little blasphemous to Argento fans, is like, what happens if 5 Days, which he did after his Animal trilogy, is a hit, or if he just decides he's done with Giallo and stuff like that? Does he basically, Argento's reputation become kind of like an Aldo Lato, who did like Short Night of Glass Dolls and Who Saw Her Die? 2 very, very good Gialli, but one that kind of has a much more limited impact on the genre. So it's interesting to think of after this film. These first 3 Animal trilogy films are the ones that fit most neatly into kind of the Giallo genre and the kind of golden age of Giallo when we're looking at it. Whereas I think of most of these other films that I'm talking about, in fact, everything I've talked about up to the point is, much later than kind of the Giallo heyday. So yeah, I don't know what it is about this film exactly. Hard for me to pinpoint, but it does not. I just don't like it quite as much as the other Argentos from the 70s and 80s. Okay, and the last one up, this one's a TV movie, I guess, but it's Do You Like Hitchcock? This probably should be lower than some of those films, but I enjoy it. I'm a Hitchcock fan too, and it's just fun to see some of those references. The acting and stuff, it's not great, but there's enough in this for me to enjoy. It's just kind of a very minor, fun film. Probably not one I'm going to revisit all that often, but I did enjoy it. And I also forgot, in C tier, if you care about these things, I would also put Argento's TV episode Eyewitness there. In the B tier, I would put The Tram, which I think is also well worth watching. Those were on Shudder. I'm not sure if they still are, but those are kind of like fun little TV episode, Gialli episodes. Okay, so now we are on to A tier. Serious business. These are films I definitely happily rewatch. In fact, because Argento films are so rewatchable, probably gladly rewatch these every few years or so. So first up, I have Cat o' Nine Tails. Visually, I think this film is on the weak side of things, which is probably what prevents it from going higher. Another weakness is kind of the length. It's a little long in the tooth, but it does have a really, really great performance from Karl Malden. Definitely one of the best performances in Argento film. Very, very likable. He has good chemistry with the girl. It also has some good set pieces and stuff like that. So it's a film that probably started for me at a 7 out of 10 when I first saw it, and rewatching it and stuff, I just found it a very easy film to like. So for me, I think it went out to something like an 8 out of 10. Okay, so now these next two films. And keeping in mind, this is not an ordered ranking. It's like I'm just kind of putting a group of 4 films into this tier, and I could cover it in any direction. I don't rate these next films higher or lower than Cat o' Nine Tails necessarily. So for me at least, these next two films are held back by just having a lot of unevenness and flaws, but their highs are almost just as high as the absolute very best Dario Argento films. And so the two films I want to talk about are also kind of big influences on the James Wan film that came out in 2021, Malignant, which for me at least was a lot of fun. And it's a lot of fun to see kind of the influence of Argento still coming into kind of these contemporary horror. And so the first film is Phenomena. So is this a Giallo? I don't know. It's certainly a little more supernatural than you'd expect a Giallo to be. But, Troy Holworth put this into his book, So Deadly, So Perverse, and it was good enough for him. It's good enough for me. The last 20 minutes of this are absolutely all-timer stuff. It's just totally bonkers, off the wall. We have some great, disgusting sets, incredible use of insects and animals. It also has Donald Pleasance kind of just doing what he can with pretty mediocre, shitty material. So there's a lot of weird things here. There's like the inappropriate use of heavy metal during a funeral scene that just totally head scratching and things like that. But if you, this is definitely one that has gone up in my memory when I was able to rewatch it. And it's like, okay, I know what the bad parts of this film are, but I can also look forward to the good parts, and I know what's coming up and things like that. So I think this film is really a joy to watch. And I would also include Trauma into that category as well. I think the highs of this are not quite as high, and I think it's a little bit less uneven actually than that film. So the flaws aren't quite as bad too. But it has a fantastic flashback surgery scene that was definitely an influence on Malignant. And it has some absolute bonkers moments, including the conclusion, which I think is absolutely also great. This one, in terms of negatives, held back a little bit by Asia Argento. Piper Laurie kind of doing the Donald Pleasance in this one, where she's doing a lot with not necessarily the best script or material there. So absolutely would recommend both of these films. I think they're both highly flawed, but absolute blast to watch if you can. So, these are in the same tier as Cat o' Nine Tails, but their strengths and weaknesses are very, very different from that film. All right, so last up in this list is Sleepless from 2001. Perhaps controversial because I'm putting it a little higher than I think most people would. For me, at least, this is the greatest hits Argento, and it's a lot of fun. I think there's a couple of great set pieces in here and some good practical effects. The train scene at the beginning is one of Argento's best set pieces. There's a great tracking shot at a dance recital that leads to kind of a kill. And we also have Max von Sydow continuing the great tradition of Donald Pleasance and Piper Laurie, who he does a lot with, not a lot of great material. So I think there's a lot of stuff to like here. It's obviously not quite as good as Argento's very best, but I do quite enjoy this film, and I was curious to see how I would like it kind of on a rewatch. But I'm happy to say that I do still nonetheless like it. Is it top tier Argento? No, I don't think so. But if I'm going to be rewatching anything within the last post-trauma at least, I would probably choose this film. So it's cool there are a couple films that, for me at least, are after kind of what's generally considered as peak that I think I would absolutely gladly rewatch. So Trauma from the 90s, Sleepless from the 2000s, maybe Dark Glasses will even make there eventually. That's one that I just need to marinate with and sit with a little bit longer and probably rewatch it before I would be willing to promote it to there. Okay, so now we're to kind of his big four, his Mount Rushmore films. And so first up, it's a film that I really struggled with whether to put it into A or S. In the end, I decided on S because I think it's a little bit closer to being just top tier than the films that are down below. And that is Bird with the Crystal Plumage, his debut film. It's part of the Animals trilogy. It's the absolutely most essential. I think it's easily the best of the Animal trilogy. And as I talked about earlier, he's working with world-class cinematographer who would win Academy Awards, Vittorio Storaro. He has an Ennio Morricone score. This film is absolutely fully formed. It's probably one of his most well-rounded films. It's where he probably didn't quite know what he was as far as those kind of fits into the horror scene. He's only 29 or 30 when he directed this. I think this film probably defines the Giallo genre as much as any other film. Potentially you could put Blood and Black Lace there. Those would probably be 1A and 1B as far as the influences go. This film is more influential than I think the next three films, all of which I do like a little bit more than this film. Even by the time Deep Red came out, the Giallo was more or less kind of tailing out, and that was not a film that revived it either. I think Argento's best twists, which I would include this film, Deep Red, and Tenebre, are not so impressive in terms of who kills, but just kind of how it adds up and the cleverness involved in it. This one's a little controversial because some people consider it to be a cheat. I'm less bothered by that. I don't really care about logic and things like that in these films. I think Argento's strengths are his strengths and his weaknesses are his weaknesses. I don't know many people, maybe there are some people that watch Gialli films and want stuff to add up super well. Personally, I could care less. I'm here for kind of like the fun stuff, the set pieces, the ridiculousness at times. Bird with the Crystal Plumage, super influential. Always struggle to know where to place like these really influential films, but I think as a film, this holds up really well. It's probably about as good of an introduction to the genre as anything. Personally, I definitely picked this film over Tenebre or Opera as far as the introduction, just because it kind of holds those trends a lot. I feel like it just represents kind of the Giallo and the golden age of the Giallo more than those films do. Okay, so now we are on to the next one. Easily, this is probably number 3 on the list, and that is Opera. I think this film has a lot of the similar issues to the films that kind of surround it, so things like Phenomena and Trauma. I think it has some unevenness. I don't care for the ending as that much, but I still think it's really, really good, and I don't think it's quite as uneven, and I think the highs are absolutely awesome. There's some crazy-ass set pieces with birds. There's great killer design and set design. It's right up there with his very best stuff. Visually, the camera's always moving and stuff like that, so I feel like it's easily forgivable in this film. It's, in my opinion, it still is kind of fits into that category of being a little bit flawed, but it's just, I think its strengths way outweigh its weaknesses. That's my personal opinion there. So probably the film that, I have ranked these recently. This is probably my 5th favorite Argento. I just put it a little bit outside of like that Deep Red, Tenebre, Spirit, Inferno, 4 films that are kind of like the inner core. Okay, so these next two films, Deep Red, 1975. One thing about this film that I think not everyone realizes is this is pretty late cycle Giallo. Giallo was not, kind of had its heyday for just a few years there. And for me at least, I think this film is kind of like the first exclamation point in there. And Tenebre is sort of like the second exclamation point that we didn't know we needed, but it's wonderful. And for me, these two films are 1A and 1B in just the Giallo genre period. As much as you like to give more representation to different directors here, I think it's so hard to not give it to these two films that I do think stand out amongst them. As much as I love kind of The Psychic or New York Ripper or something like that, I just got to give it to both of these movies. So Deep Red is a film that really was the one that drew me to Italian horror to start with. I mean, I'd already been into Poliziotteschi's, and this film just gripped me and grabbed me, and it made me want to watch a lot more. It has a great ending, even if, kind of like I said with Bird of the Crystal Plumage, it's not really impressive in terms of what character it is, but in just how they do kind of the realization of who is the actual killer. It has fantastic visuals and scores. If I were picking a film to show a Giallo for the first time, I might actually pick this over Bird, even though Bird's probably the better choice in just showing what it represents, just because I think this film is absolutely stunning and kind of has more wow moments to it. There's an incredible sadistic nature that you would get in a lot of his later films of just people dying and stuff like that. And it also kind of marries the sort of like supernatural elements that you would get from Suspiria in his later films to kind of the earlier Animal trilogy. And I think it kind of gives you the best of both worlds there. So, love this film. I think absolute masterpiece. Okay, and the other one, the final one, is Tenebre. And this one, unlike Deep Red, I did like this film on the initial viewing, but it's one that I did benefit a lot from reviewing it, and especially after watching a lot of Gialli, knowing a bit more about Argento, seeing more of his films, and just, because there are a lot of meta elements that kind of are clearly Argento as sort of a stand-in here, but also kind of just the genre as a whole. The genre is really, really quite dead at this point, but 1982 turned out to be a great year for Gialli, not just thanks to Tenebre, but also thanks to New York Ripper 2. So it is that kind of second exclamation point that you got. And so, I think this might be the best written film that Argento has, just in terms of like the story construction and things like that, which is funny because it comes right after the essentially plotless Suspiria and Inferno, where the plot is so much not the point that, it's like he was really becoming known for his visuals. And he said, hold on a second, let me show you what I can do. And I think he absolutely nails it here. I think just about everything in this film works. I think it's also really cool that this film is super visually striking in a way that's totally different from not only the Gialli that came before and after, stuff like Deep Red or the Animal trilogy, but also totally different from Suspiria and Inferno. And it's a film that I think continues to stand out in Argento's filmography as just being something that looks way different. So again, a fantastic ending. Love it. Depending on the day, this could be 1A or 1B with Deep Red. To me, those are the two absolute favorite Giallis there. I think Tenebre is a little bit more of an intermediate course Giallo, and one that you can appreciate more as you've seen more films. All right. Well, let me know what your Argento rankings are. Let me know how you like this episode. Give it a thumbs up if you did enjoy it. I will see you all, hopefully, for some more Italian genre content. Cheers, y'all.